Hey guys, it's Mike here, and I just saw Bill and Ted Face the Music, the third movie and long-awaited sequel to the Bill and Ted series, which began in the 1980s. Now, as a kid, I really liked the Bill and Ted movies, which starred Alex Winter as Bill and Keanu Reeves as Ted, two dopey high school kids from San Dimas, California, who want to be rock stars and have an optimistic viewpoint on life. However, things go awry for them when in the first movie they're on the verge of failing their high school history exam, which will not only jeopardize their future as friends, but the future of the entire world, which will be united through their music. That is until they get a time-traveling phone booth from George Carlin and gather famous figures from throughout time to do the most epic history report ever. Then there's the sequel, Bogus Journey, that took a totally different approach. This time the two are getting ready to perform in the Battle of the Bands, which will establish the Wild Stallions and save the future. That's when evil robot versions of them appear, killing Bill and Ted and sending them on a bogus journey of the afterlife. This sequel was very original and had some interesting set pieces, a fun performance from William Sadler as Death, and a lot of imagination. When it comes to the two of them, I actually prefer the sequel overall, but both of them have become cult classics over the years. And all of this leads into Bill and Ted Face the Music, where decades after the second movie, the two still have yet to save the world with their music, and instead are performing in front of small audiences at weddings and local bars. Bill and Ted are older now, married to the princesses, and their children from the end of Bogus Journey are now in their 20s, and are basically jobless losers themselves. Things are all going wrong here, and Bill and Ted are finally ready to move on with their lives, when Rufus's daughter suddenly appears from the future, and tells them that the world needs their help. After a trip to the future, they learn that if Bill and Ted don't write a specific song within just over an hour, all of space and time will cease to exist. So the dim-witted duo must go to the future and meet with their older selves so they can get the song after it's already been written. Meanwhile, their daughters travel to the past to gather musicians throughout history, and Kid Cudi for some reason, all in time for one final performance. So this plot is basically a mashup of what we saw in the first two films, combining elements from Excellent Adventure and Bogus Journey, while raising the stakes and trying to progress the world. In some ways, the story is handled well, in others, not so much. So let's talk about the good and the bad of this film, starting with the good, Bill and Ted. Going into this movie, I was concerned about the idea if Bill and Ted would still work in the year 2020, but they do. Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter nailed the characters, effortlessly slipping back into the roles of Bill and Ted, who feel just like older versions of the comedy duo. Not just that, but they also play different future versions of themselves, which range from massive bodybuilding prisoners to old men. All of these parts of the movie are pretty great and deliver some of the biggest laughs, especially when the older versions are trying to deceive their younger selves. Although honestly, it's not quite as excellent of an adventure as the first two parts. William Sadler also returns as Death, and he's fun when he's on screen, although he was barely in it. It was nice seeing the three of them reunited on screen once again. I just wish that they had given him more to do. And we also got a nice cameo from George Carlin's character Rufus, which they found a clever way to do, now that he's unfortunately no longer with us, combining old footage from the first film as a hologram, and then incorporating a new voiceover. Some other actors also returned to reprise their roles, such as Ted's dad played by Hal Landon Jr., and Amy Stotch returning as Missy to continue the running gag from the last two movies, now marrying another member of Bill and Ted's family. The movie also continues a number of other running gags, such as one of the underlying themes of the movies that Bill and Ted are very similar characters, which they show by having the two of them go with their two wives to couples therapy, in one of the funnier scenes of the movie. All these little things that they made sure to include were most excellent. However, some of the film was most non-heinous. So let's get into that now. As far as the cons go, the daughter's subplot isn't really as good or compelling as the other one. Their storyline is basically a rehash of Excellent Adventure, where they travel through time in an effort to gather musicians for a big performance. But it isn't done as well as in the original movie, where the characters are given more time to breathe and develop. Now, Samara Weaving plays Thea and Bridget Lundy Payne plays Billy, but they're basically just female versions of younger Bill and Ted, with Billy especially feeling like an impression of Keanu Reeves, literally doing all of the exaggerated movements that he did in the other movies. Now, there are some solid scenes along the way, but overall it just felt more like a remember this rather than a strong half of the movie. Also, out of all the musicians and performing performing artists in history, they picked Kid Cudi to be one of the central characters? Just why? He even references Station at one point, the alien from Bogus Journey. But what happened to him? It's never even mentioned here. Maybe because it would be impossible for people not to believe Bill and Ted about their adventures if they had literal aliens and robot versions of themselves hanging around. It was so the movie could happen. Also, the time travel rules are not consistent with the past two movies at all. Like how if they didn't write the song, reality ends, and people are literally being transported from all across time to the present. But why didn't any of this happen in the first two movies? Originally, it was more like a causality effect, but now there's the typical infinite timelines explanation, and it makes it all feel less creative and original than it was before. And on the topic of inconsistencies, a number of other things don't quite match up, such as the look of the future, the leadership, and the biggest difference of all being hell. The hell from Bogus Journey was so cool looking and original. It was filled with rooms with your own personal hell, and had some really creepy setups along the way. But this version is just a generic hell that could be in any movie. Not to mention that it made no sense how they even get here in this version, compared to Bogus Journey where they were sent there by an exorcism. There's also some weak visual effects throughout the movie too, although much of it was fine considering the low budget. It's not like these movies have ever really been the forefront of special effects or anything. Then there was this killer robot character named Dennis, and I honestly hated him. His design, jokes, and overall writing really did not work for me. He was basically just a worse rehash of the evil robot us's from Bogus Journey. But whereas they were funny because they basically were just a slightly more evil version of Bill and Ted, doing really petty and small things, in this movie I was more annoyed than anything when Dennis was on screen. He honestly looked like a dollar store Frieza or something. And finally, the ending is pretty weak overall, and the big twist that's revealed was so incredibly predictable that I saw it coming from the trailers. The movie also ended really abruptly, at a point where you would expect there to be more of a wrap-up for a movie that was decades in the making, and people never even expected to come out. But it kind of just cuts to credits. Although at least there is a fun after-credits scene that's worth waiting for. Or at least just fast-forwarding to, since I'm sure that most of you are just going to be watching this digitally like I did. Honestly, compared to the original ending of the series in Bogus Journey, this one doesn't work as well. Unlike there, where we're shown newspaper reports explaining how Bill and Ted changed everything, we don't see the after effects here. And honestly, this film had to retcon the previous ending just to exist in the first place, considering it wasn't just a single, unwritten song that saved the world. Bill and Ted already did that with the formation of their band in the final performance in Part 2. But looking at it from a writing standpoint, I guess I can understand why they felt the need to retcon things, since it would be much harder for them to figure out how to continue the story from there, rather than in this movie where they still haven't made it. Although maybe continuing from Bogus Journey and doing something else with time travel would have been a better story. So ultimately, I enjoyed Bill and Ted Face the Music. The other two were far better movies, but for longtime fans who just want to see another adventure with these characters, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. It still has much of the same charmingly dumb fun as the first two. But for a film like this that was made decades after the original, it could have been a lot worse. But I found myself pleasantly surprised with much of what I ended up seeing. Did the movie need to be made? Not really. But it was nice to see the old characters again and get that dose of nostalgia, before it's likely put to rest for good. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you could see all of my content right away when it comes out.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.